Welcome to your Barber Motorsports Park briefing. Barber is such a fun track, especially since they've repaved it. Very, very fun track. There's a lot going on here. To track that to go quick, there's just a lot of little nuancy things that sort of separate everybody. So we'll just kind of do a quick little overview. We've got some data. We've also got a video to watch. So let's just jump right into it. So when we start off, and I want to highlight some of these things before we get into the video and before we get into the data. So just quickly, turn one blind, and the turn in for one is very, very important. So references for where you apply the brakes as well as you turn in are a pretty big deal. And so the braking markers and the curb are just really great references. Exiting one, committing to using all the track. And there's also a great curb there as well that tells us what is going on. With 2 to 3, 2, again, using brakes in there. This is a very difficult section visually, and we use some references in there that we normally wouldn't use, which, for instance, we actually have a reference of when we start acceleration, which we'll point that out. How we use the track on the exit of 3 over 4, 5, double apex. Though on the exit, you can be pretty darn sloppy on the exit right there. We've got a lot of going on here with brake timing into 8. As we come into 8, again, brake markers for when you apply the brakes as well as you turn in, super important. Brake timing down here in museum, be pretty sloppy on the exit right there. How you get into 10 and 11, also important. The drive off, very, very important because a lot of the passing is done in 12. Can be pretty sloppy on the exit of 11. A lot of precision in this area. So where you turn in here is super important. How you approach 13, how you get over the hump here is important. And then what you do down at 14. We've experimented a lot in here over the years between being wide out at 15. And we have found just the narrower approach works really, really well in there, holding a little bit of radius in 16. And then 17, obviously a good drive on the front straight, and you can be pretty sloppy on the exit right there as well. And there's some really good references for that, which we'll talk about. So, all right. We'll kind of go back and forth here between the video and the data. So let me get all this kind of queued up. All right. So I watched a bunch of videos, and this is the one that's this particular video, as well as this portion of the video, seems to be the best for pointing out what we want. This is from 2019. We start off with Richie, and then we end up with Hayden on this lap, and it just ends up being the best that we can get for the things that we want to show. So let me just dive into this a little bit, and hang on, I want to get set up so we can go back and forth to data fairly easily. And yeah, there we go. All right. So as we start off here, I'm going to turn the volume down. So first thing that we're going to take a look here as we come up the front straightaway is being focused on your brake application, where you're going to apply the brakes. The Motor America does a really nice job with that, and it's important to not want to fade into one. So thinking about, I want to be parallel with this curb at turn in, and turn in happens about middle of the curb. So just makes it easy. Also gives you permission to make sure that you're using the brakes that you need to use the brakes. And we'll talk a little bit about the data here in just a second. So as we come down here into 1, let's take a look at what the brake graph looks like right there. And the brake graph So in general with Barber, not a lot of hard braking, and setups typically are similar to Jersey in the way that the front is just a little bit softer. We want the front to compress. There's places where we need the fork to move relatively quickly. So typically a little bit of a softer setup in the front, very, very similar to Jersey in that regard. And even with, when we look at brake pressure, where it's just not a ton of brake pressure. I did something a little bit different on this graph where we'll talk about gears, but also I overlaid some rear brake data in here as well. So the black in here is rear brake data, which we'll get into. In general, so turn one, you can really see how the end of braking at this track is very, very important. So a very, very slow, deliberate end of braking to keep geometry and roll speed up. And there's pretty much a common theme to that in all the corners. So turn one, not a ton of brake pressure, but a very, very deliberate roll off or trail off of the brakes right there. So just again, pretty important to know how we're using the brakes and these corners to keep the roll speed up. All right. And then you can see that turn in. There's even a little bit there with SDK when he was starting, but turn in's about the middle of the curve right there, good apex, and just being really aware of where you're exiting. And you can see where they're exiting, and it's something where you want to plan to use all that track on the exit of one, so you can be a little bit more straight up and down coming into two. And again, just right over the curve into two. And we don't need to let the bike drift out that far in two. You'll see a bunch of different things in there. Again, the brake here in two is kind of similar to one, just quite a bit shorter. So a little bit of brake pressure, but just a very, very deliberate trail off to keep up roll speed right there. So between 2 to 3, this is where, again, we can't really see anything there. So this is where we give you a little bit of a different reference, and that reference is simply where we start acceleration. And the idea here is we start thinking about where we want to accelerate right here. So by the time that you see this curve on the right, we need to be thinking, okay, I need to be start my acceleration there. If you wait longer than that, then it makes your acceleration late. The other part of it is that we want to use all the track on the exit. The end of the curve on the outside is just a great reference for that, which we'll see here in just a second. So, all right. Oh, let me skip ahead on this. I got my laps a little bit mixed up. Here we go. Let's watch Richie a little bit. There's Hayden. Let's go back a little bit. Here we go. All right. Yeah, right there. You can really see how Richie uses all the track out of turn 1 and then straight into 2. And again, no reason to bring the bike out. And then right in here is where we're going to start our acceleration. It's a great acceleration reference. And then on the exit, fantastic exit apex is about the end of the curve right there. Accelerate over, trying to keep the front wheel down as much as possible. Same thing here, being parallel with the track at turn in. And let's go back to the data right here. So you can see Hayden's throttle graph, the way that he builds the throttle right there. He builds, so he's using second gear right there. Kind of go back to that fourth gear up the front straight. And then third gear for 1, and then second for 2, and then goes to third, and then fourth, and then ends up going back down to second for 5. Throttle graph build out of 3. He's got to roll off a little bit going over. And again, the brake graph is just really not a lot of brake pressure. Holds the brake pressure a little bit, and then that deliberate trail off. Hayden's using some rear brake in there for the people that use some rear brake, but it's not something I'd get jacked up over, but it's something that we wanted to at least point out right there. What's interesting is that he's not using any rear brake over the hill. All right. Again, for 5, we've got some great turn-in points. You can look at that beginning of the curb as a great turn-in point right there. And brake release is about 1/3 of the way through. Still fairly narrow in here. And again, you can be pretty sloppy on the exit right here. Don't be afraid to get out there if you need to. Don't get all jacked up about that. The idea is just we want to get the throttle building. Coming down here into museum, again, we've got really good brake. We've got some really good braking markers right here, as well as these help with turn-in points as well, because also it is a blind entry right there. All right. Very deliberate, yeah, really great job there. You can see turning in just about the beginning of the curve right there. Very deliberate brake graph in here. So if you look at the brake graph in here, it's very, very deliberate, where he'll go to the brakes, release some brake pressure, go to the brakes, release some brake pressure up over the curb, and then go back to the brakes again. So very, very deliberate brake graph and brake timing in there to keep the roll speed up, also to try to keep the bike as stable, and no rear brake in this this section. All right, go back to the video. Again, trying to be straight up over the curb, still on some brake right there. And right in here, you can be pretty sloppy on the exit, not that big a deal. What matters is getting the bike back over for the first part of the S's. Watch Hayden here. So Hayden on the brakes right there, the brake graph isn't a lot right there. So if we go back and look at the graph, it's not a ton of brake pressure in either of those sections. So a little bit of brake right here, and then coming down into the second set, you can see there's 2 actual brake applications in there, which we'll talk about in just a second. So a little bit of brakes right in there, and the whole idea is trying to get the thing back to full throttle. Yeah, the other thing you'll notice is just how deliberate the throttle graph is, where he goes to it and it's a fairly slow build in all of these corners. All right, getting through there. Again, there's some really good references on the exit. He's driving through that last apex, and then right up there on that curb, end of the curb is a really great exit apex. And then getting the bike back over, and great turn-in reference point right here is the beginning of the curb. I think this is a very, very important section in here. And it really, this really starts this next section. So great turn-in point right there. On the brakes, and then still on the brakes right there. So he carries the brakes through and then accelerates over. And he didn't use all the track on this particular one. Again, I don't think I would get too jacked up on that one. You can get where Hayden is. You can use all the track on the exit. What matters is that you're driving it down this hill, and then just a little bit of brake down there. And you see that right in here. Just a little bit of brake as he comes down there to help get the front end down. And again, some throttle modulation that goes in right there. Yeah, then he gets back to full throttle. And then after he gets through that section, so if we go back to, hang on here, let's see if we can find it on the track map. Get all my windows open here. Here we go. So right here, we have a brake application. Brake application. And then he had a little bit of a brake application here, driving off here, a little bit of a brake application here. And he never quite gets back to full throttle in here, but keeps the bike moving forward. And then again, another brake application right here. And again, this is the section that we talked about where we don't necessarily want to be super wide. And a really good reference here, which we'll cover on the track walk, is this pit in sign. Lines up really well for right here. Out of 16 and 17, really notice how deliberate they are with holding their radius in 16. And the beginning of the curve is a fantastic reference right there, which we'll see in just a second. Go back to it. Again, Hayden comes in, pretty narrow in there, downshift. And then right in here, watch how deliberate he is right there, holding that to the right. And then the turn in happens just after the beginning of the curve. You'll see some riders in here with brakes and some with brakes and some without brakes. Hayden used rear brake in there. Bobby SDK used some brake there for that right-hander. So don't be afraid to use a little bit of brake there if you need it. And then drive on off. And again, same thing that you can be, I won't say that you can be sloppy on it, but just I think about committing to using that curb on the exit. So there you go with Barber. There's, like I said, there's kind of a lot going on with Barber. And then again, as we kind of look at the data graph again, highlights are how we're building the throttle, not a ton of brake pressure, some really good throttle timing in that last section. Gearing, Hayden's using down the second gear for 2, down the second gear for 5, and then he'll use second gear as well for that last set of corners. So, all right, there you go. There is your Barber briefing.